Well, hi, everybody out there. It's Rob Roberts with the Voice of Geeks Network, and I am joined once again by the one and only Bobby Blackwolf. Hey, Bobby.
Hey Rob, how you doing?
Hey, I am doing good. So, I've been hosting a podcast with my buddies for over 20 years. You've been hosting a podcast for 18 years. We've been playing video games a long time,
Yeah.
and I think both of us have a deep appreciation for retro games, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
this title just came out this last couple weeks. While we were out at Dragon Con, this title came
Hmm.
out. So something we're just getting around to now, and it's the making of Karateka, or
Hmm.
some people pronounce it differently,
Yep.
but we'll get into that in a little bit. And it's this new gold series
Gold
from
Master
Gold
series.
Master series, thank you, from Digital Eclipse,
Yeah.
where they've taken the template that they started with Atari 50 and they have put together this, not just like putting a new label on a game and re-releasing it with, oh, it's got online leaderboards and that's it, right?
Hmm.
But really trying to put a deep dive into just more than you could possibly
Yeah.
imagine in a collection. Playable prototypes, games that were never even released that led us there, and so forth. It's really like a virtual museum. So I want to start tonight with kind of like as I like to do, the too long didn't watch part for those that don't want to watch, a longer YouTube.
Hmm.
Overall, Bobby, what are your impressions of the making of Karateka?
I really like what they've done with this, and it's like I call it a digital coffee table book. So it's like one of
Mm,
those where has like I've got a lot of like the art of Star Wars and stuff that have like little script excerpts and stuff like that, and behind the scenes photos. And this is kind of like that, but it's a little bit more interactive for today's generation, and I think it's great, and it gives you a much better appreciation for what Karateka did and what it brought. And it's kind of like watching in film watching Casablanca, and you're like sitting there watching it and be like, oh, this is so derivative, and then you realize this is where it all came from.
mm.
And Karateka is basically that. There's a lot of tropes in gaming that came from Karateka, but people probably didn't see it originally.
And they did a very good job kind of framing that message, I think, is
Yeah.
another, the one thing I really liked about this game, to get to my thoughts, was that they really set out to tell a story, in the development of this game,
Hmm.
from start to finish. And, even though I think there might be pieces of that story that are kind of missing along the way,
Hmm.
I'm still very impressed at how rich of an archive of information we have. I think I'll go ahead and kind of flip over to show a little bit of the game itself here, as you've been kind of explaining here.
Hmm.
We actually can see in the game that kind of digital museum that you're talking about. So there's these different
Yeah.
sections. And so let's just kind of jump into one part here that's probably one of the key parts of Karateka and what it kind of brought to the industry. And that is that Jordan Mechner, who put this game together, took that concept of rotoscoping from old Disney movies and
Hmm.
brought it to games, which is really cool. And you'll notice you can actually watch videos about the process. I'm not going to play them here because that seems very iffy with copyright types of things, but
Right.
just to give you like a little bit of a taste, in the interest of going over, just I can look at like drawings and things like that. But there was one of these where I think it's way out here. You can actually see the sprites like overlaid with his dad, who's the one that's actually doing the motion capture there. You
Yeah.
can actually like see that all in motion, which is really cool to see here. I guess I scrolled by it so fast I went past.
I think it's that
This one,
rotoscope
there it is,
theater.
rotoscope theater.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can actually, and you can turn these on and off here. We can see, okay, that's the sprite, what it ended up looking
Hmm.
like, and you can kind of like remove the rough sprites in the sketch, or you could just see the sketch. Like, I think it's kind of neat what they've done here. I think it's
Yeah.
some really cool, inventive little stuff. So I love your description of like this is like a coffee table book, because to me this is like a living museum. And it
Yeah.
really works for Karateka for me in a way that it didn't maybe land the same way with Atari 50. And don't get me wrong, I liked Atari 50, but
Hmm.
there's so much they're trying to cover in Atari
Right.
50, right? It's like there's the Jaguar and the Atari
Yeah.
2600 and the arcade games. There's so much they're trying to cover that you don't really get the connection from start to finish of like,
Yeah.
if you go to like the Museum of Pop Culture or any type of museum that highlights one particular artist, you walk around that room and you see all
Hmm.
those different exhibits. You walk in one door, walk and see those exhibits, and you walk out the other door. And that, I think, is part of what I really enjoyed about this collection, was that I really felt like it was an experience
Yeah.
virtually of like walking around that room.
Yeah, and it takes about 4 hours is how much long I did it. I actually did it in the hotel room with you sleeping next door. That's when I
That
did.
sounds a little bit creepy.
I know, but we had there was a wall. You
No,
were
there's a
asleep.
wall. Yeah.
Yeah, we had, I was in one room. But that's where I went through like chapters 2, 3, and 4. I did chapter 1. I bought it like right before DragonCon, and then I wasn't ready to go to bed because I didn't fly across the country.
Yes.
And you were like, I'm dead. I'm
Yeah, I
gone.
was
I'm
up at
done. And I'm like,
3:30
I'm not.
Pacific. I'm out. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I went through it. Then it's about 3 to 4 hours, and it's only $20. That's also the nice thing. I've got
Mm-hmm.
coffee table books that cost more than $20 and don't have as much information as this. But the other reason this works so well is because Jordan Mechner kept just about everything. He kept every letter, every bit. Like he kept discs, and unfortunately, not everybody has kept a lot of those. But he kept just about everything, and that's another reason this was able to work. And also, like the best part of it is not the games; it's Jordan talking to his father, and we will, I'm sure, over the next like little bit, we'll talk about that relationship. But just him having a conversation in 2023 with his father, who was he was one of the rotoscoped people. He was the one running. He did the music and all that stuff, and very supportive of his college kid skipping class to make video games, and just that conversation that they had in 2023 about what they both remembered.
Yeah, that really surprised me and kind of touched me a little bit too, because I was like, oh man, my parents would have never wanted me to do something like that. They would have been so angry. Well, my dad might have winked and nod, but
Yeah.
But anyway, well, let's take a step back a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about, because when you and I both do gaming news shows, so we knew this game was coming, and we heard that Karateka was the game that had been selected as like the first game in this Gold Master series. And I have to admit, I was a little bit like, of all the games they could have picked, they went with that one. Now, admittedly, my journey through this game helped me understand, but I'm going to be honest, and I hope, if heaven forbid, Jordan Mechner or whatever see this video someday, I hope he does not take it as a sign of disrespect. But when I was young playing the Commodore 64, think 6 or 7 years old at the time, Karateka frustrated the hell out of me. And I didn't get very far in that game at all. And I just kind of wrote it off. It's like, oh, whatever. I'm going to go back and play Donkey Kong, something I feel like I can actually clear some of the boards on. I never really got very far in Karateka. So, it frustrated me early and I gave up. So admittedly, I did not have like the emotional connection to the game that maybe others do. What was your reaction, Bobby, when you heard that Karateka was the game that they were going to focus on?
So the thing that I wanted to know is, like, I wanted to see the game being played out, and that was one of the things they did, because I had the same kind of reaction as you, because like I played it as well on the Commodore 64, and I'm going to give like a little backstory. And also, Jordan Mechner, if you're watching, I'm sorry about what I'm about to show, but I was into computers because my father was into computers, very much so. I would not be surprised if there was an Altair in the house, because he was an electrical engineer. He was into all that stuff. But we had a VIC-20, we had a Commodore 64, multiple Commodore 64s in the house, and so my dad was into all that stuff. And what he did one year, I remember, probably 1984, 1985, when this game came out, is he went to a store called Software City, which was local. I actually had a business card, and I'm like, yep, I know that shopping center that it was in. And he went in, and I think because my dad also did stuff that was more adult in nature with computers, he was kind of in that area even for several many years. He helped build webcam software in the early days of the web to show webcams of women and in clubs. But so he went in, he's like, hey, what's the hot new game? And the guy said, oh, it's this Karateka game. You want it? And so I am sorry, Jordan Mechner, because what then happened was a blank disc got put in, and the actual person at Software City copied the game onto a disc so we could play it. And as you know, Rob, I have been going through the estate. My mom passed away, and so I was going through the estate. So this right here,
oh my
is
gosh,
the actual pirated copy from
Spelled
Software City
wrong.
with the name misspelled.
Yeah.
That this was the game that I played on the Commodore 64 of Karateka, and I never made it to the first gate. Like, I didn't know what I was doing.
Oh,
I could be like the
wow.
first person. and stuff, but this was it. And also there are other games on here. So like obviously he copied multiple games onto one disc. But this was my dad's pirated version. That's his handwriting of Karateka that I
What a
played
find.
as a kid.
Well, two responses for that, and one would be, well, now you paid $20 for it, so you have made your amends in some form or another, all these years later. And I know you don't pirate games anymore, and it was the 80s were a very different time, and I'm sure the creator and many other people making games back in that day are well aware of what happened in the back rooms of these types of places and so forth. And the other would be, at least he wasn't charged 20 cents because you made that floppy, but we'll save that one for another time.
We did copy this floppy, like, yes.
All right. You know, and I don't remember if the one I played was real or legit. I'm pretty sure it was at a friend's house anyway. So it's, who knows? But, yeah, it is. I guess you bring up an interesting point about something that kind of dark side that they didn't get into at all. I mean, they talk about some of the sales and how it was a little bit of a slower sell. And I think I remember one quote from his journal. He said, "Oh, we only sold one copy of the game last month. I hope this doesn't." Imagine realizing you're the one person on the planet who bought that game in November, what was it, October of '84 or whatever it was, the first one. But then obviously it ended up being like a Billboard #1 when Billboard was measuring video games, and you know the game obviously sold very well. So I'm sure it was pirated just as frequently, you know, all that time later. That's interesting that you have. Wow, and you still have the disc. That's wow.
I have a bunch of discs, and I realized how many games like this, like my dad, he loved Ancient Art of War at Sea because we actually have the actual disc of that. I did not see any original discs of any other game.
Interesting.
In any of my disc boxes, except for Ancient Art of War at Sea, and I actually have the box for it too. So like he kept the box as well, and I kept it.
Yeah. Now, for obvious reasons, we don't want to spoil everything they reveal in this, you know, because obviously, you know, that wouldn't be fair. You know, then we'd just be pirating it again. So, you know, we want to encourage people, if they're interested in it, to check it out and all that. But you'll notice I've been calling it Karateka. You just called it Karateka, which, you know, some do. So there are multiple ways to pronounce this game, but you actually find out through moving through this game that the correct pronunciation of the game is all of the above.
Whatever you want it to be.
That's right. Whatever you want it to be. So unlike the guy who invented the GIF or whatever, unlike that person, Jordan is actually on film saying, "Hey, I realized I called it Karateka, but I realized everybody else started calling it Karateka." And then he goes, "Actually, if you go to Japan, then they kind of pronounce it another way." So he goes, "You know what?
Karateka.
Yeah. Whatever it is to you, that's fine by me." So I think that's a pretty cool way of saying it at the end of the day. Now, did you notice, though, in that particular footage where he was talking about that, and there was a few other places through there, it looked like it was a different film. He looked a little younger to me. Like maybe it was paired with the 2012 release or something when they did this game.
I think some of it was recorded for social media in the late 2010s, like 2017, 2018. He did other videos. And like that might have been like a social media post or something that he had done. So there were some of those, and then there was the 2012 remake, which they touch on a little bit. But I think it was more just it was a social media thing or a Reddit thing maybe that he had answered on video.
Well, I want to take a second to highlight, you know, something that was one of my particular favorite parts of this package, and then I'll defer to you, Bobby. I know you've kind of already brought up the relationship bit, and maybe that you want to elaborate on that a little bit. But I want to talk a little bit about, as we flip back over to the game here, I want to talk about the variety of games that they've included in this collection, because I think it's very impressive. Not only can you know, if you want to relive Karateka on the Commodore 64, you can do it because they have the original port, the Commodore 64 port, the 8-bit port. They have original prototypes of, so if you want to play the version that only had the very first level, they have that all in there. And if you're bad at the game, like Bobby and I have already confessed, you can watch somebody else play it. And then you'll notice if I click the little left stick there, I can actually jump in at any time. Let me fast forward a little bit. And that's pretty cool too, because you can actually fast forward to a segment in the game there. So let's go here where somebody's actually playing. And now you can actually watch somebody playing the game. And if I wanted to, I could actually take over at some point here and play the game.
Because this is just a task. So if you're into speed running, it's a tool assisted run. And that's why you can jump in on this.
Right. Yeah. Boy, I will say though, it's funny because when you do watch the Commodore 64 version, I go, wow, you see, like, again, the Veda Cook who ported this over is interviewed pretty extensively in this collection. And you hear that, you know, she was actually had a close relationship with Jordan Mechner. I don't think they always did. I don't think the people that ported the game always did, because they also talk about an IBM port that isn't in this collection that sounded a little more disconnected. But anyway, I digress. But you
and
still
then there's the Famicom port in Japan only that had like a score bug on the right side.
Yeah, exactly. So there's all sorts of that type of stuff. And you sort of hear about the challenges. That was the really fascinating part to me, of like getting into weeds and all that. But like, this was the only way I ever knew the game. But it's interesting to me that like, and I always considered the Commodore 64 the, you know, superior system, because of course I did. I was a fanboy and a kid. That's what we did back then. But then, you know, you look at like the Apple II, the original version of the game, and I'm gonna fast forward again, you see like, oh my gosh, just look how fluid the art is in this game. And like look at how many, you know, maybe it chops a little bit when it's running and it's drawing everything else.
Once the gate comes in.
Yeah, but still, they get, I really like they get into the weeds about why that was on that system and all that stuff. But
and
it
then
just
why
felt
the
so
Atari
fluid.
the Atari port doesn't have that.
Yeah.
It doesn't look as good, but it's smoother. Now, what they did in the Commodore 64 version, what Digital Eclipse did, is that they did artificially up the frame rate that you can turn on. So you can actually, and I don't think you can do it in the task when the watch, but when you're playing it, you can up the frame rate so it actually runs smoother on a Commodore 64. But it's a little bit harder to play because it basically speeds up the game.
Yeah. Oh, and I didn't even realize that.
Of the emulator.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
That's cool. But
so you may want to try that at some point, like on the stream.
I may
just,
need to.
Kind of go,
but I need,
you can kind of see what I'm talking about.
What I need, well, okay, let me jump in real quick there, and I'll check that part out here. So you're saying if I actually play the game,
now go into
my options,
and one of them is
control type, show control, screen mode, game settings, maybe. Enhanced frame rate. Oh, there you go. See, that's hidden. I would have never found that. Okay, that's my piece of feedback. That component was too.
But now at least start the game.
Okay.
And then you can see just like, you know, how fluid it is at this point.
Right. Okay. Oh, good. You can actually jump in at some point here. Oh yeah. Even when it's animated, you can see like the frame rate and everything. I think I'm hitting the wrong button to kick and punch, but yeah. Okay. I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
Look, I got some hits in. I'm the best. All right. Anyway. I'm not going to embarrass myself further.
Yeah.
Because what I really want to show is then they do these remastered versions of the game. And, you know, if you want to talk about where it really looks smooth, because, you know, now that it's on modern systems, if you will, you see every frame and you see really just how much, and I guess there's commentary too, which I haven't even looked into yet, the whole commentary, but you really see like every frame playing out, and you can just see how well the like rotoscoping and that whole technique really came through. I thought Digital Eclipse did a really good job with this. Keep in mind, Digital Eclipse has been in the game for a long time, right? They were doing early ports of like Joust and Ms. Pac-Man on the Xbox 360, which for the time was pretty good because it brought us like the online multiplayer and the leaderboards and that, but you definitely see how this is elevated quite a bit. Yeah. This whole experience here. So
yeah, and they worked with Jordan to, you know, kind of realize his vision a little bit more with this. So like Jordan worked with them a whole lot, which also really helps this. It's not like they're, you know, not working in a vacuum and working from historical documents. They had Jordan right there, who's still active in the game industry. And now, so
were you surprised? Because I was a little bit that they didn't have like you had the old video of Jordan, right? You had the older videos of Jordan. I'm not even hitting the right button here. You had the older videos of Jordan, and then the one of him and his dad. But there wasn't a lot of like other solo interview clips of him, which I thought was kind of surprising. I don't know. So it was interesting. It's like they shot all the footage in one day and kind of got what they could.
Yeah. And well, and also I think like him and his dad work close enough together. Why would you want Jordan by himself?
I guess that's true. That's fair. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to point out, though, because I thought this was really cool, is that not only do you have Karateka, but part of the journey goes into an earlier game that Jordan developed, which was Death Bounce, which essentially was Asteroid Blaster or Star Blaster, an asteroid clone, basically. Asteroids, on the Atari 2600 that was ported for the Apple because, you know, clones were huge back in the day, just like they are on
Yeah.
mobile phones again all over. But Atari was getting a little bit sue happy. So this was never realized, this whole port, which is pretty decent for Apple IIe, hardware and all,
Yeah.
was never really fully realized, right?
Yeah, and everybody even said when it goes into, he's got a lot of the letters from Broderbund, and they're like, we can tell you're an amazing programmer. We just got to work on your game design.
Right.
And so that's why they would send things back, and that's how Asteroid Blaster turned into Starbound, and then Death Bounce, which is funny because his dad, this Francis Mechner, who's an old person, happily talks about, oh yeah, Death Bounce this and Death Bounce that. I'm like, it's like, I get it, but it's like, it's weird to hear like an old person be like, oh yeah, of course, Death Bounce, yes, let's talk about that like it's an actual thing and not some kid's funny thing.
Well, and plus the game, I mean, it went back and forth for forever, but ultimately the game was never released, even though you can play the prototype and you see how it evolved here. And what I thought was dang impressive, and one of my favorite parts of this whole collection, I thought this reimagined is fantastic for what it is. This particular Death Bounce reimagined, like they took a game that admittedly had flaws, right? And they actually kind of went back and fully realized it with this whole little story with the space train and everything.
Yeah.
They even, invoked the year. And it actually, this game plays like a fun little mid-80s arcade platformer, which is, what it essentially was supposed to be. And it's actually, it's kind of fun to play, like as like an early twin stick shooter of sorts.
Yeah, but the evolution of Death Bounce to Karateka is very important in Karateka. So you're like, why is there a space shooter in my karate game?
Right.
And it's because this is how Jordan went from, I want a game that ends with game over, to a game that ends with the end.
Yes.
And that is a big, and all the rejections from Death Bounce and all of the responses from Broderbund was, why are we doing this? Why do give it replayability? Why are they doing this? Why are you shooting these balls? And so he actually came up with stories and had grander ideas about, oh, you're trying to get to the end of this, why are we doing this? Where Asteroids, I don't care why I fight, I just have this little triangle and I'm shooting little pixels at big
because
polygons.
I gave the machine a quarter, that's why I fight.
but there's no quarters here, so you don't have to make it hard to get more quarters. They've already got their money. Now how do you keep them there?
Go ahead.
And that's what, like, learning from Death Bounce and all the rejections of Death Bounce and all of the notes sent back via U.S. mail to him, and he was like mailing floppies in U.S. mail across country because the kid was in Harvard. He was actually like skipping class to make Death Bounce to send it to California on via U.S. mail on a little disc. And that's kind of how his game design thought process came into being. And so Death Bounce is very critical to the Karateka story, even though it's not about karate at all.
Right. I wanted to ask you, Bobby, some more in-depth thoughts on some of your favorite parts of this collection.
So my favorite part really was the talk between him and his dad, because I am also a musician. His father was really a businessman and all that stuff, but he also was a very accomplished pianist and a composer, basically a Renaissance man. And his father's still with us and still is of sound mind and everything. So, and has a lot of memories about this. And actually him and Jordan talking about it for the first, like, and they kind of say for the first time, like having an in-depth discussion in like 30 years. That was just really touching. It was a father proud of his son, and the fact that his father was proud of his son at the time, even though he's going to Harvard and skipping class, but his father still supported him. And also, so having those and his father remembering things and, oh, here's what your mother did and here's what I did and here's how I felt. And then also talking about the music. Here's Wagner that I, put in for this music, and here's how I composed the music and the chord structure that I used and stuff. It was just the amount of memory that he had, that how much he remembered, or at least how much he, recalled or looked back through notes or something so he could say it, but just the amount of detail that was still available in 2023 to give us that background. I really liked the interplay between Jordan and his father Francis.
I thought it was good too. I this is going to get really weird because it was something I noticed. I thought it was shot a little weird. is that like it looked like somebody was shooting it on a phone, like standing above them, and it looked
Hmm.
very. I hate to say kind of crudely shot, but that was the impression I got just compared to how
Hmm.
nice artistically a lot of the rest of it was. I thought for as
Hmm.
special as those conversations raw, and maybe that's what the director was going for, was a little more of a raw conversation,
Yeah.
or and I think the reality is, and I just have to accept, and it's fine, it might be a nature of the pandemic. It might literally be like a third person that was living there too. Like there's
Hmm.
talk that he has a sister, somebody else in the family
Yeah.
was shooting it on a phone and sending it to them. And
Yeah.
that because of the pandemic. And that very well could be the case and why. So I have to let it go a little bit. But I just
Yeah.
thought it felt a little rough compared to some of the very nicely framed either Zoom footage or like
Hmm.
when they shot the scenes with Beta Cook. It looked like a very green screen, but it looked a little
Yeah.
more film than I
Yeah.
think the others did. So just something I noticed.
Yeah, well, they probably couldn't, they didn't want to transport Francis to a studio, because I think
Yeah,
that's probably what
that's
happened
fair.
with Betty Cook is you can go to like a studio that has a green screen and a good camera and then Zoom,
Yeah.
and so they shoot it over Zoom, but you record it locally in the studio and send them the footage.
That's fair. That's fair. What else do I want to talk about with this? I want to talk about, well, I guess since we're talking about maybe some areas that could be improved a little bit, like were there any things where you're like, oh, I hope if they do another one of these games, and we'll talk about that, a little
Hmm.
bit, like where maybe this series continues potentially. Is there anything you'd like to see them improve on a potential part 2, part 3 with different games highlighted?
It's very hard to say, because a lot of this is attributed to how much information was kept. And one other thing that I really did like
Sorry.
is I wanted to talk about the Super 8 footage.
Oh, please go
They
ahead.
did
Sorry.
not have the Super 8 footage of the karate master who actually did the karate moves. They did have the Super 8 footage of everything else. So Jordan's dad, Francis, was running. So the running moves are Francis. The actual karate moves are his karate master that Jordan was learning from. I think his Jordan's sister was the princess
Hmm.
that got hugged, and then Jordan actually was the bad guy,
Hmm.
and doing pointing, Akuma, I believe is his name.
Go away. Yeah.
Yeah, and stuff. And so, but you have all of that footage. They have all of that Super 8 footage, and you can play it at full speed
Hmm.
and just see like how many times he ran back and forth in those woods. And it's
And you
because
can
that was
catch other
kept.
little things in the footage too. Because I caught there's a cat. There's very
Hmm.
clearly a family cat that they were filming too, and I was like,
Hmm.
"Where's the cat in the game?"
Yeah. Well, and there was
Oh,
supposed to be a
that's
cat
right.
in
The
the
leopard.
game.
The leopard. Yeah.
There were or a panther. They didn't decide which one it was,
Yeah.
and they even worked on the sprites for it, and
But
they
that
just
was
never
not
brought it
based
in.
off the family cat.
No, but they might have thought about having the cat run and rotoscope that into the panther.
Maybe. Interesting.
But then they're running into size limitations, memory limitations, stuff like that.
Okay. All right. So, admittedly, I got a little ahead of myself, but now let's
Hmm.
take a look at what might be some things you would want to see improved for, game number 2 or 3 or wherever this series goes.
I can't think of too much to improve on yet. Because it, like I said, it really is about how much information is there. If there was less stuff available, I've been like, I would have loved to have seen more drawings and stuff. But admittedly, a lot of these things, people don't keep that stuff.
Yeah.
And so, maybe having some, like, the problem is Karateka came so early, like there was no footage at the time of Karateka being played. Like the news didn't cover computer games yet. So you
Mm.
can't go to like old stock footage of people playing it. And so, but like seeing like other things, like reactions from the time period of people who played it, and like stuff filmed in 1985, not people saying, I remember 30 years ago, like me holding up my old disc, but people like actually having footage of people playing Karateka. There was some
Ah.
pictures of the time, like of Jordan programming it, but like I would love to see that, but I don't think it existed for Karateka, so I cannot fault them for having it in there.
Yeah.
But more time period stuff of here's what people at the time said about it. Did they
Mm.
appreciate it at the time?
Mm. That's very good. Very good points. Yeah, because they talk about sales, but they don't, and they talk a little bit about. I think like one critic review is in there, but they don't really.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. They probably, and I guess to piggyback on that, and yeah, I again, and I want to make it clear. My impressions of this game are very positive, and I really like how they've laid this out. And if nothing else, I think people should buy this game so that they're encouraged to make more about other games, because the level. For as much as we've talked about how much game preservation has been hurting in a lot of different areas, like this is definitely setting a bar very high for what game preservation should really look like, because it's not just game preservation, it's like process preservation as well. Some of the very frank letters and the ways they're speaking to each other, that is all also worth preserving. I think it really captures a gaming industry that the majority of gaming fans today probably didn't live through, and gets to see. Even you and I, who did live through it a little bit as kids, we never saw that end of it. And it's so fascinating. I think that's what makes that stuff like, oh my God, this is how the sausage was made. Like it's really fascinating. Right. But I will say, one kind of pitfall about being so heavy on the rich stuff you do have is that some of the things you don't have stick out a little more. And what I mean by that is that one place for me where I was a little bit like, oh, I wish we kind of saw more of that, was that they talk quickly in one side. It is addressed, and you see some screenshots of an edutainment game that Jordan Mechner made between the time that Deathbound, never released, and Karateka, kind of came to be. And there's no playable version of it, which is fine because it was probably a different publisher. I think it was, so they probably couldn't get the rights, or it's, as an edutainment game, it probably wasn't, preserved to the same capacity. But what I noticed about it was that the sprite work in that game was a lot more elevated from what we had seen in Death Bounce. And to me, it kind of led to, oh, there's a bridge here, like where I think some of the concepts for having Mount Fuji in the background, or the large gate and the very large, because there's a singular screen where it's talking about like an edutainment game that got ported to Spanish that says gato, and it has a very large picture of a cat. And I was like, oh, that was like some of his early sprite work with very large sprites.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of like, I feel like there's a gap here. I feel like there's a missing diorama on the wall, or that's under construction or out on loan or something there. But again, this is a minor gripe, all things when all things are said and done. But sometimes when you are trying to tell a story like that, some of the missing pieces stick out. You know what I mean? And I think the other piece that kind of sticks out for me is that they address that there was a Famicom version and there was an IBM version, these other things, but most of them are just relegated to screenshots, and we don't hear a lot more about them. And again, I get it, rights issues. I'm not expecting that we can play the full game, but I'm also kind of like, it left me to wonder, like, was there maybe a little bad blood? And I don't know. I'm left to make it up because we don't know, and maybe a story they didn't want to tell here. And when you kind of gloss over it like that, I'm left to assume, oh, there must be some bad juju with the IBM makers, because they kind of talk about that they're nitpicking it, but they don't really show an interview or much more. Like, what happened there? That's the only problem, I think. So
yeah, and I think it's because they want to promote Karateka, like Digital Eclipse is looking at like and trying to make it look good and all that stuff, and so they don't want to dwell on things that can't be changed. They don't want to dwell on the past. They don't want to dwell on the bad things, because this is, at the end of the day, a commercial product. This is not a museum that shows also the bad stuff. It is a commercial product that feels like a museum.
I do understand, but when we're talking about this elevated level of preservation, I think you have to preserve the bad stuff too, or things that might not be as joyful to talk about. The video game crash in the industry happened during the creation of this game, never addressed, which again, it probably didn't impact it at all. It doesn't need to be brought up.
Because computer games didn't stop during the crash, just console games.
So there's just there just feels like there's pieces that maybe there's rocks we do need to look under to get the big picture. But again, I assure you, I'm being a little nitpicky here. It's fine,
You kind of have to be. You have to be. Good. You have to nitpick.
You do. It definitely sets the bar pretty high that you have to nitpick a little bit. So let's talk. So one also thing I can't help but notice in this collection is that they call it, even in the icon, On the PlayStation, you'll notice, because I bought it on PlayStation, but this is available Switch, you were mentioning. I believe it's on Steam, Xbox. It's on all those places, right?
Yeah.
But if I actually go back and look at the icon and all that for this
Actually,
game,
if you go back to the main menu as well.
oh, okay? I was gonna say you actually see a very clear number 1
Yes.
in there. It's the Gold Series number 1. There it
Gold
is.
Master Series number one over there on the right.
Yeah. So this implies the existence of at least a 2, or that they are thinking about what possibly, is going to come next. Is there any, Bobby, do you have any, like, what would be, like, say, a hope, something you would want to see in this collection? What do you hope to see?
Yeah. So I thought about this for a little bit and what I would love to see. And I go a little bit later because, like, I don't want them to be pigeonholed in, oh, you've got to be computer games from the early 80s, because the 90s work too. And something that I think might have still a lot of information, like other things about it. I want to see something about the old Sierra games. So like King's Quest.
Oh, yes.
Get Ken and Roberta Williams in and get some of those documents if you can.
God, yes.
About King's Quest. And I remember, they might not be able to do Leisure Suit Larry or like at least have a wide release of it. But I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago, Al Lowe, the creator of Leisure Suit Larry, actually put on eBay a lot of the documents that would have been great for this collection. So I know they're out there.
Right.
Maybe the 2 guys from Andromeda have the Space Quest documents, and stuff like that. But I mean, Roberta probably has a whole bunch of stuff about King's Quest, and it can start with, the game, the Mystery House, or, the games that they made that led up to the original King's Quest. And then, have the different versions of King's Quest and have, Roberta's commentary and stuff like that, because that. And because it was the first game for the IBM PC. Okay, and it shipped with the PC Junior. That was the whole thing. They shipped it with King's Quest to say that, yes, IBM can make you can play games on this. It's not just for spreadsheets, and King's Quest was that game. So maybe doing a Gold Master Series on King's Quest, and I would actually love to see it go up through like King's Quest 4 or 5 or something like that, because showing how things change, the addition of music cards and sound chips and stuff, and then going from the text parser to the mouse in 5, and you can even include the NES port of King's Quest 5. I would love to see something based on the old Sierra games. But let me throw this back at you.
Okay.
A little bit. You actually on your podcast, Orange Laundry, you had a theory about some of the things that you actually think might even be coming. So I want to ask you, not only what would you like to see, but what do you actually think is coming?
Well, on the first part, what would I like to see? Please interview all these people while we still can. Yes, I would even. I didn't even think front of mind Ken and Roberta Williams, but God, yes, when you mentioned that, like, please get them to just spill everything and so forth. And for me, Sid Meier is the one where I'm like, oh my God, a deep dive on like Civilization and just the influence that it's had on an entire genre of games. I don't, again, I think I'm speaking very selfishly, because I feel like the original Civilization would be, it might be a little weird, but you're going to ask me my hopes and dreams. That's the one, just because I have so many memories of that particular game. I would also love if they got into maybe some of the Japanese development. We've seen them do a lot of US based development between Atari and, now this. I would like to see maybe a little bit about the behind the scenes, like maybe a big Nintendo release, like maybe something like, I don't know, I'm going to throw out something. Why did Metal Gear have to be an Ultra Games release? And talk a little bit about some of the Metal Gear Snake's Revenge that was a little different. I don't know. That's a very random one in my brain, but I think one that would have a very compelling development story to tell potentially. I would be very cool. But
and I will also say, to add to the Sid Meier, it's another prolific game designer, American game designer around the same time that I would love to see, Will Wright.
SimCity. Yes. Oh my God, SimCity, the things you could do with that game. Holy crap. Especially if you could somehow get Nintendo on board for that version too. And
because they found the NES port. Remember, the Video Game
yes,
History Foundation
yes,
found the ROM of the NES port
yes. Oh, that'd be
that they
incredible.
abandoned to go do the Super Nintendo port.
But that would require Nintendo to embrace this digital preservation thing a little more.
I hope they do.
I hope
Doug
they do,
Bowser,
too.
get on that.
I hope
Come
they
on.
do. Hopefully this sells decently on the Switch and they
Yes,
have a more compelling argument.
I bought it on the Switch, so I am helping.
Okay, so I bought it on PlayStation. I didn't help, but at the end of the day, every sale helps.
No,
All right.
you helped.
But okay, so the clues, I think, as to what could be games 2 and 3. Well, there's a very obvious one set up at the end. And if we don't say it, somebody will point it out in the comments. So at the very, very end, it talks about Prince of Persia and that there was no Karateka 2 because a lot of the concepts, they show a fan-made Karateka 2, which I actually thought was a very interesting video. And they show, some of the concept art. They show a lot, actually. But they essentially say that ended up being Prince of Persia, and that's a story for another time. As if there's a subtle wink at the camera when they say that.
Yeah, and what was interesting about that last chapter is it was going through, like, the next game he was making was this platformer, and it was going to be kind of more of a Jumpman platformer type thing. And it's like, oh, okay. And then, like, one of the last screenshots, I look at it, I'm like, that's Prince of Persia.
Yeah.
Like, it clicks, and you're like, I've seen those walls before. That's Prince of Persia. And then it says, yeah, Karateka 2. A lot of it was brought into Prince of Persia, story for another time. And if Jordan has this much stuff about Karateka, he probably has all these things for Prince of Persia as well. So that is an obvious one. Yeah.
Yeah. I would actually be a little disappointed if that was number 2, however, because then it would show that they don't have access to a lot of other libraries. But here's the thing. So my thought is, and this is, again, admittedly a little pie in the sky, but it's the other people that were kind of randomly, seemingly interviewed in this. And I'm talking about John Tobias, who is co-creator of Mortal Kombat. And at first I was like, okay, sure, maybe it's a game he loved growing up. And yeah, obviously he was very well known for taking cinematic karate moves and putting them into a game. His interview makes a lot of sense. But I was like, but what if? And then I thought back as I'm watching all these footage, I actually thought back, Bobby, to the panel you moderated at Dragon Con last year that had the guys that were the mocap. They were there. And what did they bring with them to show on their laptop on the projector?
45 minutes worth of original video footage of them doing all the moves for Mortal Kombat.
They were touting that, like, this isn't available anywhere. I mean, I'm sure they take it on tour with them to all the places they go, but otherwise you don't get to see this. And I was like, the footage is out there. They've got Tobias on the line. And how easy would it be if you're asking him, let's say you set up a 2-hour chat with him. I want you to tell me all these things about Mortal Kombat. Okay, with these last 10 minutes here, tell us a little bit about these. We're doing these other titles. Tell us about how Karateka might have influenced you.
Yeah.
And then take some of those clips and put them in this. So there was him, and then there was a guy from ID Software, and the whole time I was like, what does ID Software have to do with, and that's the one that sticks out even more, because I was like, what does ID Software have to do with any of this? Or like, maybe they just know, but then it was like, but he pulls out a disc of Castle Wolfenstein, right?
Yeah.
And so I was like, oh, Wolfenstein 3D, another, or it, again, a game where they could talk about the early versions of the game and how that led to a shareware revolution.
Yeah,
so
well,
my money's on
difficult.
Wolfenstein 3D as the next game.
So that would be difficult because Return to Castle Wolfenstein, the Commodore 64 game that it was based off of, was not by id Software. That was somebody else's game completely. They just enjoyed the game, and so they made Wolfenstein 3D that kind of called back to Return to Castle Wolfenstein. Or Escape from Castle Wolfenstein, or I can't remember what it was actually called, but there was it was a different developer entirely that made the Commodore 64 Wolfenstein game that I remember originally.
I still wonder if some of those issues wouldn't have eased up a little bit, because after all, they put the Asteroids clone straight in this game. Now, of course, Digital Eclipse clearly has a relationship with Atari, and there's another example of how maybe some of this was like, hey, when they were working with the Atari 50 guys, hey, we're doing this thing on Karateka. Do you care if we put the, and like, who's going to care that this old game is in there, right? So maybe some of those issues can be resolved. Is I don't know why. My brain is like,
they just have to find the rights holder to the original Castle Wolfenstein game. That's going to be probably the hardest part, because who knows who owns it.
Yeah. So but my money, Wolfenstein 3D. will be the next one. But we'll see. We'll see. Honestly, it could be something very random too. I'm very, just trying to read the tea leaves a little bit, but it seems like they've got a
Mhm.
plan to do more than one, and they're
Yeah.
gonna really get some use out of this engine they started with Atari 50 to build lots more museums. But I'm very much into it. We've come a long way from Namco Museum and the
Yes.
3D polygon.
Yeah.
Come a long way.
No, I was when I read about this, I'm like, I know I'm there day one,
Hmm.
and I was there day one, and I am going to be there day one for whatever they do next.
Hmm.
And it is totally worth the $20.
Yeah.
That's it. So that's the full price. That's not the sale price. It is actually $20. And even though it does take you about 4 to 5 hours to go through it, so some people will say, well, $20 for 4 hours worth of content, but it's so deep and rich, and it does teach you a lot about the old time game industry. I love it. The only other thing, the other thing actually, I was thinking about, like, what could they add possibly if they go back to some of these old Atari games or something. Show the source code, because
Ooh.
they have the source code for some of that,
Oh
and actually
yeah.
comment it. Because like it's
Mm.
like because I have actually seen the source code for, like, let's say Pac-Man on Atari 2600, which everybody says is a terrible port. It's actually a masterclass in how to program for the Atari 2600 because of the limitations, and they actually have the source code, and they've annotated it and commented it, so you can kind of see how difficult it was to code in assembly at the time, and show some of the source code because some of that still exists.
I love that. Oh yeah, just taking in a deep dive. I mean, they already did an Atari collection, but just taking that
Yeah.
deeper dive. Again, the only thing
Hmm.
with the Atari collection is, as much as I did enjoy that, it just it was almost too much, right? It's trying to
Yeah.
cram too much into a space in the museum. So yeah,
Yeah.
now that you can
And
see
the
what's
Atari
possible with the
collection
deeper dive.
the Atari collection was more about the games, where
Hmm.
I believe this is more about the coffee table book.
Yeah, yeah.
Because the games really, like Karateka, it's once you get it down, it's a 15-minute game.
Hmm.
And so this is more about the story around it and the evolution that it took, and not necessarily Karateka itself. Although the remastered, it has trophies and achievements and a bunch of, like, missions and stuff that you can do, and stuff. So
Yeah. I will say here to kind of summarize it, I think my thoughts on this is that, like, again, and I was transparent in this in the beginning. Karateka was not a game I was necessarily a fan of growing up or as a kid. Like, it
mhm,
was not a game I would consider myself a fan of. But thanks to going through this experience, I now understand why I should be a fan of this game, and I
yeah.
am now. So I guess that's probably one of the highest compliments I could probably pay this package. So.
And that's what a good documentary does as
Mhm.
well. Like, if you watch a documentary on an old movie, you appreciate it more if it's done well.
Yeah, that's so true. All right, Bobby, any closing thoughts here before we roll credits?
I am sorry, Jordan Mechner, for my dad pirating your game back in 1985. I hope that one day you forgive me.
All right. All right. Well, if even one person buys as a result of this video, I'm sure you will be
Yes.
forgiven. You got 2 sales here. So, all right. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. We will be back with more. If you want to hear us talk about other games too, we don't just go do deep dives on retro games, but
Hmm.
I knew just in talking to Bobby, it's like, okay, we have a lot more to say on these games that go
Yeah.
beyond our podcast. So we wanted to do a special side video. But Bobby, quick plug for the podcast if somebody out there, heaven forbid, doesn't know about it yet.
So I host the Bobby Blackwolf Show. I named it after myself. I started it in 2005. Thought I was only going to do it for 18 weeks. I've been doing it over 18 years now. It is Sunday night, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, here at the Voice of Geeks Network Twitch channel, twitch.tv/VOG Network, or available anywhere you get podcasts, because it's been everywhere. There's podcast networks I don't even know about that it's on. It's been around that long. So you can catch me there or on social media at Bobby Blackwolf, just about everywhere.
And I'm Rob Roberts. You can catch me here at the Voice Geeks Network at VOG Network. And on my personal social medias, I'm at Mr. MR Rob Roberts on Twitter. Also, just Rob Roberts over on Blue Sky. And I will also, of course, plug Orange Lounge Radio, which I do right after the Bobby Blackwolf Show for 21 years running, and going. Also at the Voice Geeks Network and on Twitch. So that's it. That's going to do it. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. We'll see you next time with our next video. Take care. Bye.